The small town of Fairhope, Georgia, woke each morning to the sound of church bells and whispers carried by the southern breeze. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's business, or thought they did. Yet, among the familiar faces, there was one boy who moved like a shadow, a silent figure blending into the background. Theo Collins, 16 years old, dark-haired, pale-skinned, with eyes that seemed too old for his age. His silence wasn't just the absence of words. It was a presence, heavy and unbroken since the night his parents died 8 years ago in a car accident that left him in the care of his grandmother. Margaret Collins was a woman of quiet dignity, her silver hair always tied in a neat bun, her blue eyes watching Theo with a tenderness edged by worry. She loved him fiercely, but no amount of love could undo what had been done. Theo had simply stopped speaking. Not a word, not a whisper. The doctors called it trauma-induced mutism. The town called it strange. At Fairhope High School, he was known simply as the Ghost. He walked the halls like he wasn't there, shoulders slightly hunched, a tattered leather notebook always under his arm. Students barely noticed him except when they chose to. Jake Harris noticed him, Fairhope's golden boy, tall, broad-shouldered, with a grin as sharp as a blade, quarterback of the football team, heir to the Harris family name that had built half the town. Jake loved the attention he got, and he loved his control over the social order of the school. And Theo was an easy target. "Hey, Ghost, lose your tongue again?" Jake's voice rang out in the hallway one morning, drawing snickers from his entourage. Emily Carter, Jake's girlfriend, blonde, flawless, always watching, smiled tightly. Tyler and Sophia, Jake's closest friends, laughed on cue. "He doesn't talk because there's nothing in his head. Isn't that right, Ghost?" Theo didn't flinch. He never did. His gaze remained distant, fixed somewhere no one could follow. He simply turned and walked away. The laughter echoed behind him, but Theo's mind was already elsewhere. He retreated to the library whenever he could. The town's old records fascinated him. Maps, legends, and stories most had forgotten. Most days after school, he would climb the gentle hill at the edge of Fairhope to where the bell tower stood. The tower was tall and narrow, built of red, brick faded by time. It had stood there for over a century, watching over the town like a silent sentinel. The tower was a source of endless rumors, stories of hauntings, missing people, and things best left unsaid. No one went there. Except Theo. He knew every inch of it. The winding staircase, the worn wooden steps that creaked underfoot, the way the sunlight filtered through the cracked stained glass windows at dusk. He had drawn the tower dozens of times in his notebook, each page more detailed than the last. Hidden passages, strange symbols carved into the stone, markings no one seemed to notice. The tower wasn't just a building to Theo, it was a puzzle, a story waiting to be told. Still, Fairhope High kept spinning the way it always did. Ava Mitchell had arrived at the school just weeks earlier. New to Fairhope, she was curious, sharp, and drawn to mysteries. She noticed Theo from the first day, how he moved like a shadow, always watching, always silent. She had heard the stories, the ghost boy who never spoke. But Ava didn't believe them. There was something in the way Theo's eyes lingered on things others ignored, details, patterns, secrets. One afternoon, Ava approached him in the library. "Hey, you're Theo, right?" Her voice was soft, unassuming. Theo didn't look. Up from the map he was sketching, Fairhope streets with the bell tower at its center. "I've seen you up at the tower. You like mysteries?" she asked, glancing at his drawings. Still no response, not a flicker of acknowledgement. Ava waited a moment longer, then smiled sadly. "Maybe next time," she whispered, turning away. But Theo's pencil paused for a heartbeat. At school, things remained the same. Jake's taunts didn't stop. "You know, maybe we should take the ghost up to the tower for Halloween. Let him meet some real ghosts." The others laughed, but Jake's eyes glinted with something darker. Curiosity, maybe, or the desire to see what would finally break the boy who refused to respond. Fairhope was preparing for the Fall Festival, an annual event that brought the whole town together. Bonfires, games, music, it was tradition. But Jake had plans for something else. That night, the tower, the legend, and Theo Collins. Theo knew. He always knew. He had seen Jake and his friends whispering, glancing at him with smirks that promised trouble. But he didn't run. He never ran. The tower called to him, as it always did. There were answers inside, answers he wasn't ready to share, secrets he wasn't ready to voice. Not yet. As twilight fell over Fairhope, casting the town in shades of gold and shadow, the bell tower loomed on the hill, silent and waiting. Theo Collins moved through his days with the quiet precision of someone who had learned how to disappear. Morning started early at his grandmother's house, a modest home on the outskirts of Fairhope. The scent of freshly brewed tea and old books filled the air. Margaret Collins always left breakfast on the small wooden table. Oatmeal with honey, a routine she never broke. She didn't expect conversation, not anymore. Instead, she'd offer a warm smile, a soft squeeze on Theo's shoulder as he headed out. Theo would nod, appreciating the gesture. This silent understanding between them had been built over years of unspoken pain. School was a different story. Fairhope High buzzed with the energy of teenagers caught between dreams and boredom. For Theo, it was just another place to walk through without being seen. His routine never changed. He would slip into the library during free periods, hidden between dusty shelves and worn pages. The library was his sanctuary. Here, he devoured mystery novels, stories where quiet people uncovered hidden truths. More than that, Theo spent hours sketching. His notebook was filled with maps of Fairhope, detailed street routes, alleyways, and most importantly, the bell tower. Every brick, stair, and hidden crevice of that tower was etched in his memory. It was his world, a place where silence wasn't strange but necessary. Meanwhile, Jake Harris dominated the hallways. His presence was loud, commanding. Jake's confidence wasn't just built on football trophies or his family's legacy. It was built on control. He controlled who mattered at Fairhope High and who didn't. His girlfriend, Emily Carter, always hung by his side, perfect and poised, though her smiles rarely reached her eyes. Tyler and Sophia trailed behind them, laughing too loudly at Jake's jokes, nodding at his every word. Together, they ruled the school's social scene with effortless cruelty. And Theo? Jake seemed obsessed with reminding everyone that Theo was different. "Yo, Ghost," Jake would call, his voice echoing through the halls. "Still drawing your little pictures? Maybe if you spoke, you could tell us what's so fascinating." The taunts always came with smirks and glances from the crowd. But Theo never gave Jake what he wanted. His face remained unreadable, his gaze steady. Jake hated that. Deep down, he needed a reaction. Yet no matter how hard he pushed, Theo gave him nothing. Then there was Ava Mitchell, the new girl. She wasn't like the others. With her curious eyes and quiet determination, Ava noticed what others ignored. She saw how Theo watched the world, how his gaze lingered on patterns, how he seemed to know things no one else did. Ava had always loved mysteries, drawn to puzzles and stories waiting to be unraveled. Fairhope, with its whispered legends and old secrets, fascinated her. But more than anything, it was Theo who intrigued her. Ava tried to talk to him. At first, simple greetings in the hall, then attempts at conversation in the library. "Hey, Theo," she'd start, sitting across from him with a smile. "You always sketch the tower. Why? What's up there?" But Theo would never respond. His pencil wouldn't pause. His gaze wouldn't lift. Ava wasn't deterred. She could see the focus in his drawings, the precision, the details others would overlook. She knew there was a story there, and stories always had a reason. Still, breaking through Theo's walls wasn't easy. Weeks passed, and Ava's curiosity grew. She started spending more time at the library, quietly watching as Theo's hand glided over paper. She recognized patterns in his sketches, symbols etched into the tower's stone, lines that seemed more like a coded message than simple drawings. "You know something about that place," she whispered one afternoon, half to herself. Theo didn't react, but his hand slowed for the briefest second. Ava smiled. She would wait. Outside the quiet sanctuary of the library, Jake's world spun with his usual arrogance. Yet, something gnawed at him. The upcoming Fall Festival, a night filled with bonfires, games, and tradition, was the highlight of the year. But Jake had other plans. The bell tower, the legend, the perfect setting to remind everyone why he was the king of Fairhope High. "We should go up there," he told his friends one afternoon, leaning casually against a locker. "Prove the tower's nothing but a pile of bricks. Ghost Boy will love that. Maybe he'll finally show some emotion." Tyler laughed. "You serious? That place is falling apart." "Exactly," Jake grinned. "Makes it more fun. Besides, our friend Theo here knows the place inside out. He'll be our guide." Emily hesitated. "Jake, that place gives me the creeps." Jake's smirk didn't waver. "That's the point. The decision was made. Jake didn't care if Theo wanted to go. Theo didn't get to choose. He was part of the plan, whether he liked it or not. Theo knew something was coming. Jake's glances had become more pointed. His whispered whenever Theo passed by. Yet Theo didn't run. Instead, he found himself back at the bell tower after school, tracing his fingers along the cold stone walls. His notebook lay open, sketches of hidden rooms and winding staircases staring back at him. He knew the tower's secrets better than anyone, and he knew that whatever Jake had planned, the tower wasn't just a building. It was a story waiting for an ending. Ava watched from a distance that afternoon, her gaze thoughtful. She had no idea what Jake was planning, but she knew one thing. Theo Collins wasn't just a silent boy with a tragic past. He was a key, and the bell tower wasn't done with him yet. The night of the Fall Festival arrived with a chill in the air and the scent of bonfires drifting across Fairhope. Strings of glowing lanterns hung from trees, laughter echoed through the school courtyard, and music pulsed from speakers set up near the football field. The entire town seemed to have gathered, parents chatting over pumpkin pies, children running between booths, and students losing themselves in the energy of tradition. But for Theo Collins, the night was different. The buzz of celebration meant little to him. His eyes, as always, drifted toward the silhouette of the bell tower, standing dark and still against the deepening sky. Jake Harris was in his element. Surrounded by his friends, he laughed louder than necessary, his grin wide as people greeted him. Yet his gaze kept flickering toward Theo, who lingered near the edge of the crowd like a shadow. Jake's plan had been set for weeks. Tonight wasn't just about the festival. It was about the tower, the legend, and the ghost boy who refused to speak. He couldn't resist the opportunity to force a reaction from Theo in front of everyone. "All right, it's time," Jake said, nudging Tyler and Sophia. "Let's take this party somewhere interesting." He turned to Emily, who stood beside him with folded arms and a hesitant expression. "You coming?" Emily glanced toward the tower, barely visible in the distance. "Jake, are you sure about this? That place is dangerous, and dragging Theo along, it's—" Jake cut her off with a smirk. "Don't worry, it'll be fun. Ghost Boy here needs to stretch his legs anyway." Before anyone could protest, Jake strode across the festival grounds toward Theo. "Hey, Ghost!" he called loudly, drawing a few curious looks. "Come with us. We're going to the tower." His tone left no room for refusal. Theo stood still for a moment, eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Jake stepped closer. "What's wrong? Scared of a few stories? Thought you liked that creepy in place. The crowd didn't pay much attention, just another night, another moment of Jake messing with Theo, but Ava Mitchell noticed. Standing near a booth, her gaze followed the group as they moved toward the path leading up the hill. Her stomach twisted. Something wasn't right. The group reached the base of the bell tower just as the last light faded from the sky. The air felt heavier there, the silence deeper. The tower loomed above them, its bricks darkened by age, the windows reflecting the faint glow of the festival below. "Creepy, huh?" Tyler said, forcing a laugh. Jake pushed open the rusted door at the base of the tower with a screech that echoed into the night. "After you, ghost," he said, gesturing mockingly for Theo to step inside. Theo hesitated only for a moment before crossing the threshold. The familiar scent of dust and decay greeted him. He had been here countless times, memorizing every crack and shadow. But tonight felt different. The air was wrong. Jake and the others followed, their footsteps echoing off stone walls. Emily clung to Jake's arm. "Jake, this place isn't safe. Let's just go back." But Jake wasn't listening. His focus was on Theo, who had moved ahead, his hand brushing lightly against the wall as if feeling for something. The narrow staircase spiraled upward into darkness, and the group followed reluctantly. Suddenly, a sharp smell filled the air. "Smoke." "What's that?" Sophia asked, panic creeping into her voice. Jake froze. "Tyler, did you bring something?" "No," Tyler said, voice rising. Theo turned sharply, his eyes wide. In the dim light, the smoke was visible now, curling along the floor from below. The realization hit all of them at once. There was a fire. "The door!" Emily screamed. They rushed back down the staircase, but thick smoke blocked their path. The flickering light of flames was visible at the bottom, rising fast. The old wood of the tower groaned under the heat, a deep, resonant sound that echoed like a warning. "We're trapped!" Tyler shouted. "No, no, no," Emily sobbed, pulling at Jake's arm. Jake pounded against the stone wall, his confident facade crumbling. "There's got to be a way out." But Theo was already moving. His face, calm yet focused, turned toward a section of the wall most wouldn't have noticed. He gestured, sharp and insistent, for them to follow. What is he doing?" Sophia cried. "He knows something." Ava's voice came from the stairwell. She had followed them after all, unable to shake the feeling that something would go wrong. She looked at Theo. "You know how to get out, don't you?" Theo didn't answer. He simply pointed to a narrow passage, almost hidden by shadows. The others hesitated, glancing at each other in fear and confusion, but the heat from below was growing unbearable. The creaking of the structure became louder, almost deafening. Jake swallowed hard. "We follow him. We don't have a choice." Theo led the way through the narrow passage. The smoke thinned slightly, and as they climbed higher, they came upon a small hidden room. The space was cramped, the air dusty, but it was safe. For now, Ava shone her phone's flashlight around the room. Her beam landed on strange symbols carved into the walls. In the corner, covered in dust and cobwebs, lay a small chest. Inside was a weathered diary, a tarnished medal, and a piece of burned fabric. Ava's brow furrowed. "Lila Monroe," she whispered, reading the faded name on the diary's cover. "Who was she?" No one answered. Theo stood still, his hand resting lightly on the chest. His expression had shifted. There was no fear in his eyes, only determination. The tower groaned again, this time louder, closer. The structure wouldn't hold much longer, but there was more to this night than a fire. Theo knew it. The symbols, the diary, the legend, everything was connected, and the truth was waiting. The tower creaked with a sound that echoed like a warning bell. The smoke thickened, curling around the group like fingers tightening in a grip. Fear spread through Jake and his friends as the realization sank in. They were trapped. The fire below crackled menacingly, the glow of the flames dancing along the stone walls. Emily clung to Jake's arm, her breath ragged. Tyler and Sophia huddled close together, panic etched on their faces. Only Theo stood calm amidst the chaos, his expression unreadable, his dark eyes sharp and focused. As the others shouted in fear, searching for an escape that didn't exist, Theo moved. Without a word, he gestured urgently, his hands precise and confident. He pointed toward a section of the wall, a part that looked no different from the rest, but that he had marked in his mind long ago. Jake hesitated, blinking at him in confusion. "What are you doing, Ghost? There's no way out," he barked, his voice cracking under the strain of panic, but Theo didn't stop. He pressed his fingers against the cold stone, sliding them along its rough surface until he found what he was looking for. A small notch, almost invisible. With a firm push, a low grinding sound echoed through the room. The group stared in disbelief as a narrow passageway hidden behind a false wall creaked open. "What the hell?" Tyler muttered, eyes wide. Ava stepped forward, her gaze flickering between Theo and the passage. "He knew," she said, breathless. Theo knew this was... "Here!" Jake shook his head in disbelief. "No way! How?" Theo didn't wait for them to process it. He waved his hand, beckoning them to follow, his face set with determination. The groaning of the tower grew louder, splintering wood, cracking stone. The fire below was growing closer. Smoke poured into the room. There was no time for questions. "Go! Move!" Ava urged, pushing Jake forward. One by one, they followed Theo into the narrow corridor. The walls were close, the air stifling. The passage sloped upward, away from the fire. Theo led the way, his steps sure. Every turn, every incline, he knew them all. He had walked this hidden path countless times alone, but now, with lives depending on him, each step felt heavier. The corridor opened into a small chamber, lit only by the glow of Ava's phone flashlight. Symbols were carved into the stone walls, strange, intricate markings that seemed almost to hum with secrets. In the center of the room lay a wooden box, scorched along one side. The air was cooler here, the smoke thinner, but the danger had not passed. "What is this place?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Ava knelt beside the box, brushing away the dust. Inside, a tattered diary lay beside a tarnished medal and a strip of fabric burned at the edges. The initials LM were stitched faintly into the cloth. "Lila Monroe," Ava murmured, turning the diary over in her hands. "It's her name. The girl who disappeared." Jake stepped back, his face pale. "Lila Monroe? No, that's just an old story. Some ghost tale. It doesn't mean anything." But Theo wasn't looking at Jake. His eyes were locked on the medal, its surface dulled by time, but still bearing a name he knew too well. Edward Harris. A sudden groan shook the tower. Dust rained from above. The structure was weakening. The group exchanged fearful glances. "We have to keep moving," Tyler cried. Theo didn't move. His fingers closed around the medal, and for the first time in years, emotion flickered across his face, recognition, pain, and something deeper, a memory long buried. His grip tightened. "Theo!" Ava shouted, pulling him back to the moment. "We have to go." Snapping from his trance, Theo nodded. He tucked the medal and diary under his arm and turned toward a staircase winding upward, a final path to the top. The air was clearer the higher they climbed, but the tower groaned in protest with each step. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed. Jake stumbled, a rotting floorboard giving way beneath his feet. With a terrified shout, he fell, one leg pinned beneath a fallen beam. "Jake!" Emily screamed, rushing back toward him. I can't move." Jake gasped, panic flooding his features. The others hesitated, fear rooting them in place. The fire's glow was visible through the gaps in the stairs. The tower wouldn't hold much longer. "Leave him!" Tyler shouted desperately. "We have to go!" But Theo didn't hesitate. Even after everything Jake had done, every cruel word, every taunt, he turned back. Without a sound, he knelt beside Jake, leveraging his body against the heavy beam. Jake stared at him in disbelief. Why would you help me?" Jake choked out. Theo didn't respond. With a final push, he freed Jake's leg. Ava grabbed Jake's arm, helping him to his feet. Together, the group stumbled upward. The final door to the tower's rooftop was stuck. Smoke filled the stairwell. With no time to spare, Theo rammed his shoulder into the door, once, twice, until finally, with a deafening crack, it burst open. Cold night air rushed in. They tumbled onto the rooftop, gasping for breath. Below, the town's festival glimmered, oblivious to the disaster above. Sirens wailed in the distance. The tower groaned one final time. A fire truck's ladder rose to meet them. One by one, they descended to safety. As the group reached the ground, Theo paused at the edge of the rooftop. For a moment, he looked back at the tower, the place that had held his silence for so long. The flames lit the night sky behind him, casting shadows that seemed to whisper secrets. Theo Collins had saved them all, not with words, but with the silence that had always hidden the truth. The night air outside the tower was sharp and cold, but it wasn't enough to clear the weight of what had just happened. Flames still licked the edges of the crumbling structure, sending sparks into the night sky. The flashing red and blue lights of emergency vehicles cast eerie reflections across the faces of the crowd gathering below. Fairhope had noticed now. The whole town was watching. Yet, even as firefighters worked to extinguish the blaze, Theo's mind wasn't on the fire or the narrow escape. It was on the diary, pressed tightly against his chest, and the medal still cold in his hand, Edward Harris engraved deep into its surface. Jake sat on the ground, his legs scraped but not broken, glancing nervously at the tower and then at Theo. His face had none of the smug confidence he usually wore. The events of the night had stripped that away. For the first time, Jake looked at Theo not with mockery but with uncertainty and fear. He knew a way out, Jake muttered to himself, still breathing hard. All this time, he knew. Ava stood beside Theo, brushing ash from her jacket. Her gaze kept flickering between him and the diary. The cover, worn and blackened at the edges, bore a name that sent chills down her spine, Lila Monroe. The name wasn't unfamiliar. It had been whispered among the older residents of Fairhope for decades, an unsolved mystery, the story of a girl who vanished without a trace. The legend said she had been last seen near the bell tower, but stories in small towns were twisted over time, becoming more myth than truth. "Theo," Ava said softly, careful not to startle him. "You knew this was there, didn't you? The diary, the medal, all of it." Theo didn't answer, he never did, but his eyes said enough. The same focused intensity they had shown in the tower was still there, like he was putting pieces together, connecting threads that no one else could see. The group had been moved away from the burning tower by paramedics and police officers, but the questions had only started. The townspeople whispered, casting glances toward the teenagers who had somehow survived the fire. Theo remained silent, as always. But inside, his mind raced. The tower wasn't just a crumbling landmark. It held secrets. Secrets tied to Lila Monroe, to Edward Harris, and somehow to Jake's family. Later that night, gathered in Ava's dimly lit living room, the group sat together for the first time without the usual hierarchy of high school life dictating the mood. There was no mocking from Jake, no disinterested glances from Emily or Sophia, only questions. Ava placed the diary gently on the table. "We have to read it," she said, her voice steady despite the lingering adrenaline. "Whatever's in here, it's the reason we're alive. Theo knew how to get us out because of this." Jake shifted, uncomfortably. "It's just some old book, probably full of nonsense." "No," Ava replied sharply. "It's more than that. Lila Monroe disappeared. People have been talking about it for years. And your family's name, Edward Harris, is in here." Jake's jaw tightened. My grandfather had nothing to do with some old story. Theo tapped the cover of the diary, his hand slow and deliberate. His eyes locked onto Jake's. No words were spoken, but the message was clear. You're wrong. Ava opened the diary. The pages were fragile, yellowed with age. The first entries were simple, descriptions of Fairhope, the tower, dreams of leaving the small town behind. But as Ava flipped through, the tone changed. October 15th, 1972. Edward says he'll meet me at the tower. He says there's something he needs to tell me, something no one else can know. October 17th, 1972. He seemed scared today. Said things about Fairhope that didn't make sense, secrets about the town, about his family. He told me not to write it down, but I don't trust that. What if something happens? Ava looked up at Jake, whose face had gone pale. This can't be right, he stammered. Theo leaned forward, flipping to a final, nearly illegible entry. October 20th, 1972. If something happens to me, the truth is in the tower. Edward said he would protect me, but I don't believe him anymore. The room fell into silence. Jake sat back, staring at the diary like it might burn him. No, my grandfather wouldn't. He couldn't have. Theo reached into his pocket and placed the tarnished medal on the table beside the diary. The engraved name gleamed faintly under the lamp's light. Edward Harris. Jake recoiled slightly, shaking his head. No, this doesn't prove anything, but Ava was already connecting the dots. Lila Monroe went missing the same year Edward Harris stopped teaching at Fairhope High. The same year the tower was closed off. Your family built that tower, Jake. And now we find this. She gestured at the diary and the medal. Lila's last words were about him. The pieces were there. Theo had known all along, the maps, the hidden passages, the symbols. He had been studying the tower for years because he knew it held the truth. The fire had brought them to that hidden room, but Theo had known how to get there because he had been preparing. Jake rose abruptly. This is crazy. My grandfather was respected. He helped build this town. He wouldn't hurt anyone. Ava's expression hardened. Maybe he didn't, but someone did. And your grandfather knew. Theo remained still, his gaze never wavering. For years, his silence had been a shield, a way to protect himself from the world. But now it was clear, his silence had also been a preparation, a quiet observation of the truth no one else had seen. The fire hadn't been an accident. The diary, the medal, the tower's hidden passages, none of it was coincidence. The past wasn't buried. It was waiting, and Theo Collins had just uncovered the first layer. The room felt colder after the final entry in Lila Monroe's diary had been read aloud. The faint hum of night sounds drifted through the half-open window, but inside Ava's living room, silence pressed heavily over everyone. Jake Harris stared at the diary and the tarnished medal as though they were ghosts themselves. The engraved name, Edward Harris, gleamed dully under the dim lamplight. Jake's jaw clenched. His face was pale, his hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles turned white. But Theo knew what lay behind Jake's bravado. Fear, not of the fire they had escaped, but of the truth that now threatened to unravel the Harris family's carefully cultivated legacy. No, Jake muttered, shaking his head as if the motion alone would dispel the reality before him. This doesn't mean anything. My grandfather couldn't have, he wouldn't. His voice trailed off. Ava turned a sharp gaze on him. Jake, we almost died in that tower tonight. A fire doesn't start by itself. And Lila Monroe's last entry, she wrote about Edward Harris, your grandfather. This isn't some coincidence. Sophia and Tyler exchanged uneasy glances, shifting in their seats. The hierarchy that had once defined their group had crumbled, and now uncertainty loomed where arrogance had been. Theo hadn't moved from his spot. He sat still, back straight, watching Jake. His dark eyes were steady, unwavering. Jake refused to meet them. "Why do you keep looking at me like that?" Jake snapped suddenly, his voice cracking. "You don't speak, you don't explain. What do you know, huh?" Theo didn't flinch. Slowly, he reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, an old, fragile map of Fairhope. The lines were precise, the landmarks familiar. But at the center of the map, encircled in thick, dark pencil, was the bell tower. Arrows pointed to hidden routes, tunnels, beneath the structure, and symbols scribbled in the margins. It wasn't just a map, it was a blueprint of secrets. Ava leaned forward, studying the lines. "You mapped the entire tower?" she whispered in disbelief. Theo nodded. His finger traced a path along the paper, down winding staircases, past the hidden room where they had found the diary, and toward a section of the tower no one had dared enter. A point marked with a single word, basement. "The basement," Ava murmured. "But that's sealed off. The school board closed it decades ago." Theo's gaze sharpened. He tapped the map again, insistent, urgent. Jake swallowed hard, glancing away. "It's been closed for a reason. No one's been down there for years." Theo's eyes narrowed. "No one?" His silence seemed to ask the question for him. Ava looked at Jake, her expression darkening. Or maybe someone didn't want anyone going down there. Jake shot to his feet, knocking his chair back. "Enough! This is insane!" he barked. "I'm not going to sit here while you accuse my family of what? Murder? Hiding bodies? No. One's accusing you, Jake," Ava said coldly. "But the truth is there, in the basement, and Theo knows it." Jake paced the room, running a hand through his hair. The confident football star who had mocked Theo for years was gone. In his place was a boy running from a truth he didn't want to face. But Theo remained patient. He had waited years for this moment, for someone to finally see. Suddenly, Ava turned back to Theo. "The fire tonight, was it a warning? Or was someone trying to destroy the evidence?" Theo didn't answer, but the way his hand tightened on the medal told her everything. Someone had wanted that diary buried, and someone had almost succeeded. The next day dawned grey and cold. Fairhope buzzed with rumors about the fire at the bell tower. The official story was vague, an electrical short, faulty wiring, but those who had seen the flames licking the old bricks whispered darker theories. The tower had always been a place of stories. Now, the whispers had returned. Theo stood at the edge of the school grounds, his dark hair ruffled by the wind, his gaze fixed once more on the tower's blackened silhouette. He could still smell the smoke. His mind replayed the symbols carved into the hidden room's walls, the final words in Lila Monroe's diary. "The truth is in the tower." Behind him, footsteps crunched on the gravel. Ava appeared at his side, her arms crossed against the morning chill. "You're going back, aren't you?" she said softly. Theo didn't turn. He didn't have to. Ava could read the answer in his posture. Jake arrived moments later. His face was drawn, dark circles under his eyes betraying a sleepless night. He hesitated before speaking. "If there's more to find." "I'm coming too," Jake said. His voice lacked its usual arrogance. There was only resignation and something else. A need to know. Theo looked at him for a long moment before nodding. The decision had been made. The truth lay beneath the tower, in the basement sealed for decades, in the shadows where no one had dared look, and this time Theo wouldn't be going alone. The charred remains of the bell tower loomed in the pale light of dawn, casting long shadows over Fairhope. The smoke had cleared, but a heaviness lingered in the air, as if the tower itself mourned the secrets it could no longer keep hidden. Theo stood before the blackened entrance, flanked by Ava and Jake. His eyes traced the jagged cracks along the bricks, fractures in both the structure and the lies that had been buried there for decades. The faint scent of ash still clung to the stones. It was time to descend into the past. No one spoke as they crossed the threshold. The fire had taken its toll. Burnt wood crunched beneath their feet, and ash drifted through the air like ghosts. Ava held the flashlight steady, illuminating the path ahead. The staircase leading upward was partially collapsed, scorched by flames, but Theo's focus remained on a narrow door beneath the main level, the entrance to the basement. The door had once been sealed, its rusted iron lock a clear message, "Keep out." But the fire had weakened it. Theo approached without hesitation. With a sharp glance back at Jake and Ava, he pressed his shoulder into the door. The metal groaned but held. He stepped back, breath steady, then rammed his weight into it again. With a final screech, the lock snapped and the door creaked open into darkness. A damp, cold air rushed out, carrying with it the scent of mildew and something else, something older. Jake hesitated, staring into the void. "I never knew there was a basement here," he muttered, voice hollow. Theo glanced at him, no judgment. In his eyes, only purpose. He gestured forward. Ava was the first to follow, stepping into the darkness with the flashlight's beam piercing the gloom. Jake swallowed his fear and followed, leaving the town's morning light behind. The staircase was narrow, winding down into the earth. The air grew colder with each step. Faint markings lined the walls, symbols Theo had memorized long ago from his maps and drawings. They weren't random, they were a message, a warning. When they reached the bottom, the flashlight revealed a wide chamber with stone walls. The basement had been untouched for decades. Dust coated every surface, and broken. Wooden crates lay scattered. A large iron bell, smaller than the one atop the tower, lay toppled on its side. But what drew Theo's attention was the far wall, where a section of bricks had been disturbed. Theo approached slowly, running his hand over the uneven surface. The bricks here were newer, not matching the rest of the structure. Someone had sealed something behind this wall. Recently or long ago, it didn't matter. The truth waited beyond it. Jake stepped forward, his voice barely above a whisper. What is this place?" Ava turned the flashlight to the ground. Her beam landed on something half buried in the dirt, a silver chain glinting in the light. A delicate locket dangled from it. Ava picked it up carefully, wiping the dust away. The initials engraved on the front read, L.M., Lila Monroe. Ava whispered. Jake backed away, shaking his head. "No, this isn't right. This can't be here." Theo didn't react. His gaze remained on the wall. He pressed his hand against the bricks again, searching for weakness. The sound came suddenly, a deep, low groan from above. The tower's damaged frame was shifting. A cascade of dust rained down from the ceiling. "The tower's giving in!" Ava cried. Another rumble shook the ground. The structure above them groaned louder, wood and stone grinding together. The ceiling cracked. "We have to get out of here!" Jake shouted, panic rising in his voice. But Theo stood firm, his hand clenched into a fist. The wall had to come down. Whatever lay behind it held the answers he had been searching for his entire life. With determination burning in his eyes, Theo grabbed a rusted metal rod from the ground and swung it hard against the bricks. The impact echoed like a gunshot. "Theo, stop!" Ava screamed. Another strike. The bricks trembled. The rumble from above grew louder. Jake lunged forward. "You're going to bring the whole place down!" But it was too late. With a final blow, the wall crumbled inward, revealing a narrow room behind it. Dust and debris filled the air. Theo stepped back as the others shielded their faces. When the dust cleared, a hush fell over the room. Inside the hidden space lay an old trunk, its lid cracked and worn. Beside it, a faded piece of fabric lay folded, stained with age. And on the floor, barely visible beneath the dirt, lay another medal, identical to the one Theo had found before, gleaming faintly with the name Edward Harris. Jake froze, his face drained of color. No, this isn't real." Theo stepped forward, pulling open the trunk. The hinges squealed in protest. Inside were photographs, black and white images, of Fairhope decades ago. In one picture, a young woman smiled beside a man wearing the same medal. Lila Monroe and Edward Harris. Ava stared in disbelief. "Your grandfather, he was with her." Jake shook his head wildly. He said she left town. He told us." But Theo pointed to the final photograph in the trunk. Lila Monroe standing before the tower, alone. The date scrawled on the back, October 20th, 1972, the day she vanished. The tower moaned above them, louder this time. A crack spread across the ceiling. "We need to get out," Ava screamed. A massive beam above gave way with a thunderous crash, trapping Jake beneath its weight. The others screamed as dust billowed into the air. "Jake!" Ava shouted, rushing toward him. Jake groaned, pinned. I can't move!" The tower shook violently. Ava turned to Theo, panic in her eyes. "Theo, help him!" For a moment, Theo stood still. Jake, who had mocked him for years, now lay helpless before him. The building trembled again. Another few seconds and the entire structure would collapse. Theo moved. Without hesitation, he grabbed the beam, leveraging his body against it. His muscles strained, his face twisted with effort. With a final surge of strength, the beam shifted. Jake scrambled free, coughing and gasping. The three of them ran. The tower roared behind them, stones crashing to the ground. As they burst into the sunlight outside, the bell tower collapsed with a final, deafening crash. They turned, watching as the dust settled. The tower, the secrets, the lies, had fallen. But Theo knew the truth hadn't been buried. It had finally been set free. The bell tower lay in ruins, a cloud of dust hovering over the debris like the final breath of a secret too long kept. Fairhope's skyline had lost its most recognizable landmark. But for Theo, Ava, and Jake, what had collapsed wasn't just bricks and mortar. It was the weight of decades of lies. The sirens were distant this time. The town would come soon, drawn by the sound and spectacle. But none of that mattered to Theo as he stood there staring at the wreckage. His hands trembled slightly, dirt smudged across his face. But his dark eyes remained steady. The truth had been buried beneath that tower. Now it had surfaced. Jake sat on the ground, his back pressed against the cold stone steps that had once led to the tower's entrance. His face was pale, his expression hollow. The photograph they had found, a young Lila Monroe standing beside Edward Harris, lay beside him. His grandfather's name gleamed faintly on the second tarnished medal in his lap. The reality of it all weighed heavier than the beam that had trapped him moments before. "No," Jake whispered, for what felt like the 100th time. "It doesn't make sense. My grandfather, he wasn't like that. He told us she left, that she ran away." Theo turned his gaze toward Jake. For years, Jake had been the loudest voice in the room, confident, cruel when it suited him. Now that voice was breaking. The boy who had mocked Theo for his silence now found himself drowning in his own words, none of them enough to deny the truth. Ava stood nearby, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, staring at the photograph. "Jake," she said quietly, "the diary, the medals, the hidden room, everything points to him. Lila never left. She knew something your grandfather didn't want the town to hear." Jake shook his head violently. "You don't know that. Maybe it wasn't him. Maybe there's more." Theo stepped forward slowly. His eyes never left Jake's. He knelt beside him, taking the photograph and holding it up. With his other hand, Theo traced a line from Lila's figure in the photo to the outline of the tower behind her. Then he pointed toward the ruins. His movements were slow but deliberate. The answer had always been there. Jake looked away. "I don't get it. Why would he hide this? Why would he let everyone believe she just disappeared?" Theo reached into his pocket, retrieving Lila's locket. He opened it. Inside, a tiny photograph of Lila rested beside a scrap of paper folded so many times it seemed ready to disintegrate. Ava leaned closer as Theo unfolded it with careful fingers. The faded ink revealed a single sentence written in shaky handwriting. "If something happens to me, Edward knows why." Jake's breath caught. His eyes widened. No, that can't. Before he could finish, the wail of sirens drew closer. Townspeople had begun to gather, staring in shock at the collapsed tower. Whispers floated on the wind. How did it fall? What were the kids doing there? Theo rose to his feet slowly, the locket still open in his hand. He turned to face the crowd. His heart pounded against his ribs. For years, he had faded into the background, a boy without a voice, a shadow slipping through the town unnoticed. But now, the truth demanded to be heard. The people stared, expecting the usual silence. But Theo took a step forward. Jake looked up at him, confusion flickering in his eyes. "What are you doing?" Ava didn't say a word. She simply watched. Understanding what was about to happen, Theo swallowed hard. His throat felt tight, as though years of unspoken words had built walls inside him. But the memory of the fire, the photograph, and Lila's final words pushed him forward. He raised his gaze to meet the town's collective stare, and then, for the first time in 8 years, Theo Collins spoke. She needed to be heard. His voice was rough, barely above a whisper, but in the stunned silence that followed, it echoed louder than the sirens. The entire crowd fell still. Jake stared at him, wide-eyed. You can talk?" Theo turned his gaze back to the ruins of the tower, his expression unreadable. He could feel the weight of every eye on him, but it no longer mattered. His silence had been a shield, but it wasn't needed anymore. The truth had a voice now. Ava stepped beside him, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. "Theo knew all along," she said, turning to face the crowd. "The tower wasn't just a landmark. It was a place where the truth was hidden. Lila Monroe didn't run away. She was silenced. And now, after all this time, her voice matters again." The whispers grew louder among the townspeople. The name Lila Monroe passed from person to person, a name that had become legend but was now tethered to a painful truth. Jake stood, his legs unsteady. He held the photograph in one hand, the medal in the other. His face was a storm of emotions, shame, confusion, and an undeniable need to know the full story. I didn't know," Jake said, his voice cracking. "I swear, my family, my grandfather, he never told us." Theo turned toward him. Slowly, he extended the locket with Lila's photograph. Jake hesitated, then took it. His fingers trembled as he closed it with a soft click. "Then it's time to find out," Ava said firmly, "because the truth doesn't stay buried forever. The tower's gone, but the story isn't over." Theo nodded, his gaze steady. The collapse of the tower wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The trauma had been confronted. The silence had been broken. And now, with his voice finally free, Theo Collins was ready to finish what Lila Monroe had started. The news of the bell tower's collapse spread through Fairhope faster than wildfire. By morning, the entire town buzzed with speculation. Some whispered about the fire, others about the teenagers who had escaped it. But what truly captured everyone's attention was the re-emergence of a long-forgotten name, Lila Monroe. It was on everyone's lips, at the diner, in the school hallways, and inside the quiet offices of the Fairhope Police Department. For decades, Lila had been a ghost in the town's memory, a shadow of a story with no ending. Now, with the discovery of her diary, photographs, and the truth buried beneath the ruins, that ending was finally coming into focus. Theo sat silently on the worn leather bench of the police station, his fingers brushing against the edges of Lila's diary. The familiar weight of the book in his lap felt different now. Heavier, but with a purpose. Ava sat beside him, her gaze fixed on the window, watching the townspeople gathering outside. Jake paced restlessly in the small room, the silver locket clutched in his hand. The name engraved inside, LM, felt like a brand. "This is my family's fault," Jake muttered for the 10th time, his voice rough. "Everything, her disappearance, the lies, it all comes back to the Harrises." "No," Ava said, turning to him with a steady look. "Your grandfather made his choices, but you didn't. You're here now, trying to make it right. That matters." Theo said nothing, but he glanced at Jake, his gaze softer than before. Jake had been the one to push him for years, but now all that power had shifted. The silence that once made Theo invisible had become the voice of truth. The door opened with a soft creak, and Sheriff Donovan stepped into the room. His lined face looked more tired than usual, but his eyes were sharp as they fell on the trio. "We've gone through the diary," Donovan said, holding up a folder filled with faded documents and photographs. "The last entries, they're damning. Lila Monroe trusted Edward Harris. He promised her protection, but she was scared. She knew something she wasn't supposed to." Jake swallowed hard, his shoulders slumping. "We also found this," Donovan continued, placing a worn letter on the table. The paper was fragile, the ink faded, but the signature at the bottom was unmistakable. Edward Harris. Theo leaned forward, his dark eyes narrowing. Donovan nodded at him. "It's a confession. Not a formal one, just a letter he never sent. Looks like Edward Harris was planning to leave town, but Lila knew something that would have ruined him. About the tower's construction, money laundering, bribes, things that would have brought the entire Harris family name down." Jake stared at the letter, his face pale. "So he silenced her," he whispered. The room fell silent. Donovan sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "We may never know exactly what happened that night, but it's clear Lila never left. She never ran away." He looked at Theo. "You brought this to light. After all these years, she'll finally have justice." Theo lowered his gaze to the diary in his lap. His fingers traced the worn leather. For so long, his silence had been a prison, a way to protect himself from the trauma of losing his parents. But now he understood. His silence had kept him listening, watching, piecing together a truth no one else wanted to see. Jake sat back in his chair, staring blankly at the wall. "What happens now?" Donovan folded his arms. "We're going to reopen Lila's case. The town deserves the truth. And Lila deserves more than a forgotten name in an old story." Outside the station, the crowd had grown. Reporters, townsfolk, students, all waiting for answers. As Theo, Ava, and Jake stepped onto the porch, a hush fell over the group. All eyes turned to them. Jake hesitated, glancing at Theo. "You should tell them." Theo looked at the crowd, faces filled with curiosity, suspicion, and hope. The silence stretched, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was waiting. Theo took a breath. "She needed to be heard," he said, his voice steady, though soft. "And now she has been." The crowd remained silent for a moment, the words settling over them. Then slowly, heads nodded. The whispers began again, but this time they weren't rumors. They were acknowledgments. The town had heard Lila Monroe's story. Days passed. The remains of the bell tower were cleared, and plans for a memorial began. For the first time in years, Fairhope spoke openly about its past. The Monroe family, long gone from the town, would have their closure. Jake stood beside Theo and Ava at the edge of the construction site where the tower once stood. A plaque had been placed there temporarily, in memory of Lila Monroe, a voice silenced but never forgotten. "I never thought things would end like this," Jake said, his voice quieter than usual. "Maybe it's not an end," Ava replied. "Maybe it's a beginning, Theo stepped forward, brushing his fingers against the plaque. The wind stirred his dark hair, but his face remained calm. For so long he had been the town's ghost, unseen, unheard. But now his voice had echoed where it mattered most. Jake turned to him, his expression serious. "Hey, I was wrong about you. All of us were. While we were running our mouths, you were the only one who knew what was important." Theo met his gaze, giving a small nod. There was no need for more words. As the sun set over Fairhope, casting golden light over the town, Theo, Ava, and Jake stood together, watching the shadows lengthen. The tower was gone, but its story remained. Lila Monroe had been silenced, but not forgotten. Justice had been served, and in the process, Theo Collins had found his voice, not just for her, but for himself. The truth had finally been heard, and in that truth, healing had begun. Months passed, and winter faded into spring. Fairhope had changed. The bell tower, once the town's looming guardian and keeper of secrets, no longer dominated the skyline. In its place, a newly built memorial stood, a modest stone circle surrounded by flowering dogwoods. At its center, a plaque glinted in the afternoon sun, engraved with words that now carried deep meaning for everyone who passed by, in memory of Lila Monroe. A voice silenced but never forgotten. The unveiling ceremony had drawn the entire town. Families gathered, whispers hushed as the mayor gave his speech about remembrance and healing. But no one waited for his words. They waited for the boy who had once been Fairhope's ghost, the boy whose silence had hidden truths deeper than anyone imagined. Theo Collins stood at the edge of the crowd, the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. The breeze tugged at his dark hair, and the scent of spring blossoms mixed with the faint trace of fresh stone dust. He had spent years in the shadows, a silent figure moving unnoticed. But today was different. Today, they were all here for the truth he had unearthed. Ava Mitchell stood beside him, offering a reassuring smile. "They're ready for you," she whispered. Her eyes shone with pride and quiet encouragement. Jake Harris was there too, standing a little apart from the others. His usual arrogance had been replaced by a quiet resolve. Jake had changed. The Harris name no longer stood untouchable. It now carried the weight of history. But Jake had chosen to face it, rather than hide from it. He gave Theo a nod, not seeking forgiveness, but showing respect. The mayor finished speaking and stepped aside, motioning for Theo to take the podium. The crowd fell silent. The breeze stilled. All eyes turned to him. Theo had rehearsed this moment in his mind for weeks. But standing here, looking at the faces of people who had once ignored or mocked him, he knew the words would have to come from the place that had been silent for so long, his own voice. He stepped forward, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. He gripped the edges of the podium. For a moment, he closed his eyes. The memories came rushing back, the cold stone of the tower walls, the symbols he had traced with his fingers, the weight of the diary in his hands, and the voice he had kept. Locked away for 8 long years, when he opened his eyes, they were steady. The silence isn't empty. His voice was soft, rough around the edges from years of disuse, but in that quiet space, it carried like a bell ringing over the town square. The crowd leaned in, breath held, listening. Sometimes silence is where the truth hides. Theo continued, his words slow but clear. We all heard the stories, the legends about the tower, about Lila Monroe, but no one listened long enough to hear what really happened. She wasn't just a rumor, she was a voice this town chose to forget. A voice that deserved to be heard. He paused, glancing at the plaque. The afternoon sun reflected in his eyes. My silence wasn't because I had nothing to say. I was listening, learning, waiting for the right moment. And when the tower burned, when the past tried to bury itself again, I realized that the only thing louder than a voice is the truth it carries. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Faces that once held doubt now showed something different. Understanding. Theo looked at Jake then. For a moment their gazes held. Two boys tied together by a legacy of silence and discovery. Jake gave him a small nod. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Theo turned back to the crowd. Lila needed to be heard. She trusted someone who betrayed her because she knew something that mattered. But her story doesn't end in a forgotten room beneath a tower. Her story ends here, where the truth lives, where her voice echoes. He stepped back from the podium. The wind picked up again, rustling the leaves and carrying his final words through the crowd. For a moment, there was only silence. Not the heavy, suffocating kind that had followed Theo for years, but a respectful, listening silence. Then, slowly, the crowd began to applaud, soft at first, then louder. Theo didn't smile, but his shoulders lifted, as though a weight had finally been set down. Ava squeezed his arm. "You did it," she said simply. As the ceremony ended, people lingered at the memorial. Some placed flowers at the base of the plaque. Others simply stood, reading the inscription, lost in thought. The story of Lila Monroe was no longer a forgotten rumor. It was part of Fairhope's truth, a truth the town had finally chosen to acknowledge. Jake approached Theo as the crowd thinned. He looked at the plaque, his jaw tightening before he spoke. "My family. We have a lot to make up for. But you gave her a voice. You gave us all a chance to hear it." Theo met his gaze. "The truth always finds a way." His voice was steadier now. The boy who hadn't spoken for years had found the power in his own words. Jake nodded, glancing once more at the plaque. "You're right. It does." As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the square, Theo, Ava, and Jake stood together before the memorial. The bell tower was gone, but what it represented, secrets, silence, and pain, had been replaced by something far more enduring: truth, justice, and healing. Theo Collins wasn't the ghost of Fairhope anymore. His silence had transformed into a voice that echoed far beyond the ruins of a forgotten tower. It was a voice that would remind the town for years to come. The silence is not empty. Sometimes it's where the truth hides.
If you enjoyed the story and want to see more content like this, support the channel by subscribing, liking, and turning on notifications.